My wife's sister called me and said she was on a date with a strange man. I didn't hesitate. I left like a bolt of lightning, my chest on fire, my head in a whirlwind. When I got to the restaurant he'd suggested, my eyes went straight to the table by the window, and there she was. Laughing. Laughing in a way she hadn't laughed with me in months. She was elegant, confident, enchanted by him. The world stopped for a second. The sound of the environment disappeared. Her breathing, her heartbeat, everything was suspended, suffocated by an invisible weight. It was as if the betrayal had stopped being a suspicion and, there, had become a present, concrete body, sitting in front of me, dressed in the perfume she always wore on our special nights. I didn't think. I didn't tremble. I just walked up to them and said, cold as steel, enjoy this moment, because you're single. Don't ever look for me again. And forget about my children. She froze. Her eyes widened as if the ground had disappeared. She stammered my name. She tried to get up. But I had already turned around. And I left. What came next was an echo that never ceased. The image of her smiling, that light, knowing laugh, repeated itself in my head like a curse. I needed to understand. Why had she done that? What was missing? What did the other person have that I didn't give? We spent years by her side. Years. We built a life, 2 children, sleepless nights dealing with fevers, split bills, long-term plans, promises. And she thought she deserved a moment apart, a pleasure on the side, a secret laugh. The cruelest thing wasn't the encounter. It was the fact that, for weeks, she had been affectionate, loving, even passionate. The mornings with lingering kisses, the dinners with eyes locked. And now it all made sense, it was guilt. She compensated for her betrayal with exaggerated doses of affection, like someone trying to balance poison with flowers. And I, blinded by love, believed her. I gave myself completely. I bet everything. And I lost. That night, I didn't sleep. I walked around the house, touched her clothes in the closet, replayed conversations, smiles, silences. I tried to find clues, flaws, moments when I should have noticed. And everything hurt. It hurt as if each memory was a stab. I relived the days when I made sacrifices for her. The nights when I arrived late, tired, but still sat next to her to hear how her day went. The times when I kept my pain quiet so as not to burden her. And behind it all, she was building this farce. And worse, she made me an accomplice to her own betrayal without me knowing it. The next morning, while I was drinking coffee alone, my eyes still heavy from insomnia, I received a text from her sister. "Are you okay?" I didn't answer. But it struck me, why had she, of all people, decided to tell me? And more, why had she, who never got involved in our affairs, decided to break this silence? I wasn't prepared for the answer. But it would come. In the form of revelations. In the form of buried secrets that, one by one, would begin to emerge. In the following days, she tried to look for me. Calls. Messages. She showed up at the door of the house, crying, saying that everything was a mistake. That she didn't know what she was doing. That it wasn't about love, but neediness. That I was always there, but she didn't recognize herself anymore and, that was all. Neediness. As if that explained it. As if that justified it. As if the vows exchanged before an altar could be torn apart by an impulse of emptiness. And when she started to kneel, there in the hallway of the house, begging for forgiveness, our children came in. And they saw. And they cried. And they asked. And I didn't know what to answer. I left. I got in the car and went to my parents' house. I stayed away for days, without contact. I needed to think. I needed to breathe. But fate, or something that seemed much better planned, wouldn't leave me alone. One Wednesday afternoon, I received another call. From her sister. But this time, with a different intonation. I need to tell you something. Something that might change everything. I hesitated. My heart raced. I still hadn't processed the betrayal and now more secrets. She asked me to go to the park where we usually took the children. I arrived without knowing what to expect. And she was waiting for me. Sitting down, with red eyes. She looked at me with a pain so familiar that it confused me. What I'm about to tell you cannot be unsaid, she began, but maybe you deserve to know the whole truth. Because I couldn't stand to see you being deceived any longer. Not just by her, but by everyone. And then she took a deep breath. And said it. And the world stopped for the second time. The betrayal was real. The encounter had happened. But what she never knew, and only discovered weeks before, was that that night, that restaurant, that encounter, all of it had been planned. Planned not by chance. But by someone who had reasons. Deep reasons. That went beyond simple envy or compassion. Her sister had been in love with me. For years. Years of watching, keeping quiet, desiring. Always in the shadows. Always watching our perfect life from the outside. And when she saw the messages her sister had exchanged with the man she was going out with that night, something in her broke. And she called me. She knew I would react. She knew I would leave her. She knew that, finally, her sister's life would fall apart. But the craziest part? She didn't do it to have me. Not immediately. Not for love in the purest sense. But for revenge. For years of exclusion. For a past in which her sister made her feel smaller. In which he used his achievements to show off. The meeting at the restaurant was a trigger. But the origin of the pain came from far away. From childhood. From comparisons. Of silent humiliation. Now, everything was reversed. The fallen, abandoned wife. I, wounded, but free. And she, the sister betrayed by life, began to show a new face. Supportive. Of affection. Be careful. He started coming to my house to help with the kids. Heard me. It comforted me. And there, in that empty space left by betrayal, she entered with light steps. No rush. No promises. But with something I haven't seen in a long time, truth. But that wouldn't be the end of the story. What seemed like a new beginning was actually just another layer of the web that fate was weaving around me. Because the pain of betrayal cannot be erased with gentle kisses. And the scar left by the one you loved the most doesn't heal easily. And because, even if no one knows, her sister is hiding another secret. One that can change, again, everything I believe in. Something that will make me wonder, even after everything, if I ever lived a truth, or if I just participated in a great theater. And that's exactly where the story really begins. Welcome to our channel. Here, we do not support, and will never support, any kind of cheating. The stories you will hear are completely fictional, but inspired by real life to show, with brutal clarity, how cheating destroys homes, hearts and futures. Prepare to feel. To reflect. And to be shocked. Because what comes next, is a story you will never forget. Good story. They met in a banal way, the kind that fate places in their path just to make it seem like a coincidence. Julia had just gotten out of a failed relationship and was trying to focus on herself, her career, and the small daily victories that helped her move forward. Daniel, on the other hand, had been emotionally alone for years, after losing his parents and drowning himself in work as a way to avoid facing his own emptiness. It was a random Saturday, in the aisle of a bookstore, when their eyes met. She was holding a blue-covered novel, he was holding a technical engineering book, almost automatic. And for a moment, the world seemed to slow down. A comment about the title she was carrying, a shy smile, and the rest happened like a scene from a movie, but without exaggeration. It was simple, it was natural. It was real. Their relationship was not one of those fiery and chaotic ones, but it was built on details, on care, on the desire to be a comfort and not a storm. Julia admired Daniel's calmness, his sense of responsibility, the way he always looked her in the eye when he spoke. He, in turn, was enchanted by her intelligence, by the way she expressed herself, how she was firm and delicate at the same time. They had different dreams, opposite stories, but a similar desire, to make it work. And that was enough. They got married 2 years later, in a discreet but meaningful ceremony. The handwritten vows were read with choked voices and sincere tears. It was the beginning of a silent promise that, despite everything, they would choose each other every day. They set up a small house on the outskirts of town, with a garden in the back and an extra room that would soon become the children's favorite space. Yes, because in a few years the children came, Mateus, the oldest, curious and dreamy, and then Leah, sweet and sensitive, always with a colored pencil in her hand and the rosy cheeks of someone who lives in a world of affection. The house was filled with laughter, scattered toys, and noisy Saturday mornings. Daniel has always been a present father, even with a heavy workload. He worked as a production manager at a logistics company, and although the shifts were busy, he made sure to be at birthdays, school meetings, his daughter's theater performances, and his son's robotics classes. Julia, who has a degree in communications, had put her career on hold to dedicate herself to motherhood, but years later, she resumed her work as an image consultant. The balance was delicate, but functional. There was no luxury, but there was stability. It wasn't a fairy tale, but it was love. Sundays were sacred. Family lunch, dessert made by her, and coffee made by him, like a ritual. The children ran around the yard while the two watched through the kitchen window, often in silence, but connected. The neighbors considered them the perfect couple. Always polite, always together, always with a look that said, "We take care of each other." There was a complicity between them that seemed solid, rooted in something that time had strengthened. And, in fact, there was. Julia was the type of person who remembered dates, preferences, and quirks. She knew exactly when Daniel needed silence and when he just wanted to be held. Daniel, on the other hand, was the man who left notes on post-its, who went shopping remembering every detail, who complimented her without having to ask. They weren't effusive, but they knew how to love each other maturely. They argued, of course. Adult life, with children, work, and fatigue, wasn't easy every day. But arguments rarely turned into war. Time, they believed, had taught them to respect each other even in moments of disagreement. There was, however, something invisible that began to emerge after more than a decade of marriage. A kind of silent fog. It wasn't unhappiness. It was the absence of enchantment. There was no sudden rupture, but small signs that spread throughout everyday life like discreet cracks in an old wall. A dinner that was too silent, a kiss given out of obligation, a hug that lasted less than before. The relentless routine took up too much space. The commitments, the bills, the schedules. Lightness gave way to efficiency. And even though they both tried to deny it, something between them was changing slowly and almost imperceptibly. Daniel, realizing this, looked for ways to rekindle their connection. He planned short family trips, tried simple surprises, and resumed their old habits, like watching series together or making breakfast before she woke up. Julia, on the other hand, said it was just tiredness. Life, after all, takes its toll. And she was happy, she said. She didn't need anything else. But there was a different kind of tiredness in her eyes, not just physical. It was as if she was searching for something that even she couldn't define. Little by little, he began to dedicate himself more to work. I got more customers, went out more, smiled more outside the house than inside. Nothing alarming. Nothing that indicated any deviation in conduct. But there was an energy that felt out of place. And Daniel, even without knowing why, began to feel an uneasiness, a subtle restlessness, which he carried with him without knowing how to name it. She had always been a woman with a strong presence. She arrived at places and dominated the environment with elegance. She had a light but striking laugh. People approached her naturally. This had always enchanted Daniel. And it still did. But now he felt that her presence was no longer just his. That the glow she emanated seemed to be aimed at other eyes. It was an intuition, something without proof. But insistent. And he, out of love and trust, pushed those thoughts away as if they were unfair. The family circle continued to function. The children grew up healthy and loved. The school praised it, the grandparents were proud. Friends said they were an inspiration. And even on nights when the silence between Julia and Daniel seemed louder than the television being on, they would look at each other before going to sleep and say, "Good night," with sincerity. Because there was still affection. Because there was still history. Because there was still, above all, a past that seemed to justify any somewhat crooked present. Family gatherings showed a well-matched couple. She was always elegant, he was always kind. The looks they exchanged in front of their children showed the old partnership of someone who built a home from scratch. Daniel believed that the difficult times were just phases. That everything would get back on track. He still loved her. He still found her beautiful, interesting, admirable. And even when she seemed more distant, he never imagined that there could be any kind of real break between them. They were together. And that, in his mind, was enough. On her side, there was something harder to decipher. Julia saw herself reflected in shop windows, in mirrors, on cell phone screens, and she felt that time was passing too quickly. That her youth was slipping away at the edges of the day. That the woman she was before her children, before her home, before her responsibilities, was lost somewhere. She loved Daniel. She knew that. But she couldn't help but feel that something was missing. It was an emptiness that appeared occasionally, but became more and more constant. Like a hunger that could not be satisfied. Still, I tried. He tried to keep the house in order, the children happy, the marriage alive. She smiled in photos, made vacation plans, and answered her husband's questions naturally. There were no masks. There was effort. A legitimate effort, but perhaps insufficient. And the scariest thing is that no one understood. The neighbors saw the perfect couple. Friends saw the mature couple. The children saw the best parents in the world. And perhaps that was the cruelest part. The pain that no one sees is the one that destroys the most inside. The routine continued with its commitments, its busy mornings, its dinners that were not always shared. But there were still Sundays in the park, movies together on cold nights, loving messages throughout the day. Their story was made of this, a constant attempt to stay. To resist time, routine, wear and tear. Daniel believed that all of this was just a phase. Julia hoped that it was. And maybe they were both right. Or maybe not. But what neither of them knew, what neither of them even imagined, is that soon, destiny would bring to light buried truths, stifled feelings, and choices that would forever change the path they walked together. Because even the strongest couples hide invisible cracks. And sometimes, what seems stable is just a structure held together by the memory of what once was love. June arrived with its cold mornings and golden afternoons, and with it came new contracts for Julia, new responsibilities for Daniel, and an apparent silent rebalancing of that routine that always oscillated between exhaustion and hope. The children were fine, the school had praised their performance, and on the outside, everything seemed in its right place. But what was beneath the surface was denser, darker, and was already beginning to move slowly, like something growing in the dark waiting for the right time to emerge. Daniel, although distracted by his goals at work, felt an increasing distance in Julia's words. They were always measured, calculated, and sometimes they only answered what he asked, like someone in a hurry to end a conversation even when they say they're available. He tried not to pay attention. He preferred to believe it was fatigue, just that, the same fatigue that sometimes made him forget to get milk at the market or say goodnight with a longer kiss. Only now it was different. She seemed too full. Of appointments, clients, professional dinners, outside office hours, meetings. On Wednesday nights, she started saying she needed to meet a client who was only available at the end of the workday. It was an important contract, with promises of future referrals. Daniel believed. Because I wanted to believe. Because it was more comfortable that way. He started to stay with the children alone, prepare dinner, put them both to bed and then stay in the living room, with the television on, but without paying attention to anything. Sometimes he would doze on the couch, waking to the sound of keys turning in the door, and hearing the click of her heels on the wooden floor, her intense perfume and her short words, "Hi, sorry about the lateness." She went straight to the shower, as if she had been carrying the whole day on her back. And he accepted. Because it was easier to accept than to confront. At work, Daniel was also under pressure. The new expansion project had brought long meetings, short trips, rushed lunches, and an increasingly competitive environment. The feeling that he had to prove himself all the time was exhausting, and he often found himself staring at his own reflection in the mirror of the corporate bathroom, wondering if it was all still worth it. When he got home, he would see Julia tired, the children sleeping, and he would feel lonely even though the house was full. He tried to fill the silences with small gestures, coffee in bed, loving messages during the day, notes left in her coat pockets. And in each of these gestures there was a silent hope that it would be enough to rescue what they were losing. It was on a Friday that something really started to crack. Julia received a call and locked herself in the makeshift office she kept at home. Daniel was walking down the hallway when he heard a different tone of voice, soft, with muffled laughter. He didn't quite understand the words, but her laughter, he hadn't heard that laughter in a long time. When she left, she pretended to be normal, kissed her children, smiled at him and told him about a new client who made her laugh with her absurd stories. He agreed, pretending to believe her. But something inside him lit up. It wasn't jealousy. It was fear. From that day on, he began to observe more closely. The schedules. The smells. The smiles out of place. The cell phone always facing down. The blocking on the screens. Messages were answered in a hurry. The explanations that seemed rehearsed. He started leaving work early, showing up at home unexpectedly, and suggesting unexpected plans. In all of them, Julia always had a plausible reason for not participating: deadlines, commitments, exhaustion. And little by little, he began to admit to himself that something was wrong. The man who had always trusted now found himself suspicious. It wasn't his nature. But the pain of not knowing began to be greater than the security of ignorance. One of those nights, after she said she had a meeting at a new restaurant in town, he offered to drive her. Julia hesitated. She said she had already made an appointment with the client. That it would be more practical that way. That he didn't need to worry. Daniel insisted, but faced with her coldness, he backed down. He waited for her to come out, dressed up, impeccable, with the same glow he didn't see when they were together. He waited 10 minutes and then got out too. He got in his car and started driving around the streets near the most well-known restaurants in the area. He didn't know exactly what he was looking for, but he was sure he would recognize it if he saw it. It took a while. But you saw it. She was on an outside porch, sitting at a corner table with a man he didn't know. The conversation was close. The looks, intimate. And then she laughed. He laughed like that. The same laughter he had heard days ago through the door. It was like everything had fallen into place. Time stopped for a moment. He didn't remember how he got out of the car, how he crossed the street, how he got to the table. He only remembered her face breaking into shock when she saw him. And the silence that formed around them, as if the entire restaurant had felt the blow before he even spoke. He didn't scream. He didn't cry. He just looked into her eyes and said, with the coldest voice that had ever come out of his mouth, to enjoy that moment, because from then on she was single. And that he would never look for him again. And forget about the children. He turned his back and left. He didn't want to hear explanations. He didn't want to see tears. There was something in him that had died. A part that she had killed with every laugh she offered to another man while he believed he was still building a future with her. He returned home in silence. He didn't call anyone. He sat on the couch and stared at the wall, as if it could give him the answers he would never receive. The hours passed and he remained still, feeling the weight of a grief he couldn't name. The next morning, Julia's sister showed up at his door. She was nervous, distressed. She asked if he was okay, if he wanted to talk. He didn't want to. But she insisted. She said she needed to tell him something important. That there was more to it than he imagined. Daniel interrupted. He said he didn't need anything else. That he had already seen everything he needed to. And that if she was there out of pity or solidarity, she should go away. But she didn't go. She stayed. Silent. Sitting on the couch, while he walked around the house like a ghost. She offered to help with the children. She cooked. She washed the dishes. And at the end of the day, she was still there, sitting in the same place, with the same look of pain. In the days that followed, Julia tried to contact him. She sent messages. She called. She showed up at the door. Each time, he ignored her. But something inside him was eating away at him. It wasn't the end of the marriage. It was the end of the illusion. The realization that the love he had given so sincerely had been treated as disposable. His children asked about her. They cried at night. And that hurt him more than any marital betrayal. It was the family he had built being torn apart by the hands of those who were supposed to protect it. He started moving the furniture around, emptying drawers, and sorting clothes. He couldn't look at her belongings without feeling nauseous. He would enter her room and the smell of her perfume on the pillows would make his stomach turn. He thought about leaving the house, but decided against it. It was his house. It was his children's home. She was the one who should leave. And he decided that if she didn't leave willingly, he would find a legal way to get her out of there. He looked for a lawyer. He explained the situation. He listened to cold, pragmatic advice. Separation of assets. Shared custody. Division of assets. But Daniel wasn't thinking about money. He was thinking about dignity. Meanwhile, Julia's sister was still present. Getting closer and closer. Not out of imposition. But out of empathy. Out of care. For the children. Daniel began to see her differently. Not as his sister-in-law. But as a woman who saw his pain truthfully. Who didn't say that everything would pass. Who just sat beside him in silence. And that, for someone who had lost all ground, was everything. But he still didn't know. He still had no idea what that presence was hiding. What was behind her gesture of taking his hand when he was crying hidden in his room? Her look when she saw Julia knocking on the door. Her silence filled with intention. And when he finds out, nothing will be the same again. The weeks following the separation dragged on with a silence that seemed alive inside the house, like a permanent visitor who settled in every corner, observing, weighing, crushing the minutes. Daniel no longer knew what hurt more, Julia's betrayal or the constant effort to maintain his sanity in front of the children. He tried to follow the routine precisely, keeping up with the schedules, the chores, the forced smiles. Leah had gone back to sleeping in her parents' bed, now just his, and Mateus asked questions that Daniel didn't know how to answer. In the midst of all this, the only constant was Julia's sister, Clara. She was always there. Discreet, but present. And as the days went by, it became impossible to ignore the fact that there was a true tenderness in every gesture she made, a patience that went beyond the duty of family ties. It wasn't pity. It was something deeper, older, more painful. And he only realized what it was when he finally looked at her as if she were a whole woman, and not just an echo of his ex-wife's past. That night, the children were already asleep. Daniel sat on the couch with a half-full glass of wine, and Clara watched him from the kitchen. Her eyes held a hushed urgency, as if something that had been stuck in her throat for years had reached its limit. She approached him slowly, sat down next to him, and spoke in a tone so calm that it made him shiver inside. She said she needed to say something, but she wasn't sure if he was ready. He stared at her, too tired to anticipate what was coming, but still curious. She took a deep breath and took his hand. Not with desire, but with courage. And then she said, "I didn't call you that night just because I felt sorry for her. I called you because I knew where she was. I knew before. And I had to act. Because it wasn't the first time. And because it wasn't just about her." Daniel took a while to process. His face remained still, his eyes fixed on her. He could feel the tension rising up his spine, as if his body was trying to prepare for an impact he didn't yet understand. Clara continued. "What I'm going to tell you isn't to hurt you more, even if it will. It's because I can't bear to live with this burden anymore. And because you deserve to know. You always deserved to know. Even when no one wanted you to know." The silence that followed was filled with their heavy breathing. Daniel hadn't asked any questions yet. He was just listening. But his eyes were already changing. They were no longer those of a wounded man, but of someone about to see something that would rewrite his story. Clara let go of his hand and stood up. She walked over to the bag she had left on the table, unzipped it, and took out a small cardboard box that had turned yellow with age. She handed it to him with trembling hands. "Abra." He opened it. Inside were letters. Many. All handwritten. The paper was worn, the ink slightly faded. He picked up the first one and began to read. The contents were as unexpected as they were devastating. The letters were from Julia. Written to someone she had been in contact with for years. A man who had clearly had a relationship with her before and after their marriage. The dates were clear. The contents were clear too. This was not a recent affair. It was something old. Repeated. A cycle. And Daniel, reading each line, each confession, each word filled with desire and contempt for him at the same time, felt his soul being slowly ripped away. He dropped the last letter on the floor, looked at Clara with eyes that no longer recognized the ground beneath her feet, and asked in a low, scratchy voice, "Why do you have this? How did you know?" Clara closed her eyes for a second and then, without further ado, answered, "Because she used me. Because every time she went out with him, she called me, she said she was at my house, she used my name as an alibi. I was an accomplice. Unintentional at first. But then I couldn't look at you and see what she was doing. I fell in love with you long before I told you anything. But I never thought about having you. I just wanted you to see who she really was." Daniel stood up abruptly. The wine spilled onto the floor. His hands were shaking. He didn't know whether to scream, cry, or break something. All he knew was that there was a different kind of anger inside him. Not the explosive anger of betrayal discovered. But the silent fury of someone who has been deceived for years. Of someone who has built a life on a carefully crafted lie. "Why now?" he asked. "Why didn't you tell me before? Why did you wait for me to be destroyed like that? Why didn't you spare me?" Clara stepped closer, but he took a step back. She held back her tears, but her voice came through firmly. "Because I tried. And you wouldn't listen. Because you loved her so much that anything I said would be seen as envy, as jealousy. Because even when I saw her cheating, I believed she could change. Because she was my sister. Because you were married. Because there were children. And because I'm a coward too." Daniel fell silent. The anger was still there, but now mixed with something more confusing. A strange feeling of recognition. Of empathy. Of shared sadness. He knew Clara was telling the truth. I knew because her gaze had never been that of someone who wanted something in return. He was always one of those who observed other people's pain with an intensity that only those who experience it firsthand can understand. And now it all made sense. The reason she always stayed close but never crossed any boundaries. The reason behind the constant presence and respectful silence. She had also been injured. Not like him. But in her own way. That morning, Daniel didn't sleep. He sat on the living room floor, surrounded by the letters. I read and reread. Each one more cruel than the last. Some described moments spent with the other man while he was traveling for work. Others ridiculed the affectionate gestures he made, calling him predictable and weak. In one of them, Julia said that Daniel never challenged her, never made her feel alive. That he was too good for the kind of woman she was. That marriage was a comfortable cage, but a cage nonetheless. Daniel read it and felt his past melt away. Happy memories now carried a poison he never knew existed. When the sun began to rise, he got up. He went to the children's room and watched them sleeping. He lightly touched Mateu's face and adjusted Leah's blanket. And then he cried. Not for Julia. But for everything he believed in. For the man he was. For his naivety. For his dedication. For the loyalty he offered to someone who never deserved it. And he also cried for Clara. Because now he understood the weight she carried. Late in the morning, Julia showed up. Her eyes were red and her expression was haggard. She was carrying a bouquet of flowers and an envelope. She said she wanted to talk. Daniel let her in. He didn't say anything. He just pointed to the letters on the table. Julia stopped. She turned pale. She stammered something, tried to explain herself, but he raised his hand, asking for silence. He simply said, "There's nothing more to say. I just want you to understand what you destroyed. And to know that I'm no longer the same man you betrayed. He's dead." Julia fell onto the couch. She started to cry. She begged for a chance. She said she was confused. That she had always loved him. That her children needed her. Daniel didn't answer. He just watched her with a serenity that was frightening. He didn't shout. He didn't accuse. It was as if he were watching the scene from the outside. As if he was no longer part of it. And then Clara came down the stairs. Julia saw her and froze. Her eyes widened. Her mouth fell open. "Did you tell him?" she asked, her voice strangled. Clara nodded. And she answered firmly, "He deserved to know. And I'm tired of protecting you." Julia stood up suddenly, threw the bouquet on the floor and ran out, slamming the door loudly. Silence returned. But now it was a different silence. No longer one of abandonment. But one of reconstruction. Daniel sat down, looked at Clara and asked, his eyes still full of tears, "Do you still see me the same way?" And she replied with a small but sincere smile, "I never stopped seeing you." Daniel spent the rest of the day as if walking on a newly crumbled road. There was no more compass. The past had imploded, and the present was a minefield of tainted memories. The image of Julia sitting on the couch, desperate, clashed with every line of the letters he had read. Her every plea rang hollow, an echo of a woman he no longer recognized. But what troubled him most wasn't what she had done, it was everything she had hidden for so long and the ease with which she had manipulated even the most intimate moments. That was unforgivable. And as much as his mind sought a safe place to shelter within everything that was left, it was Clara who occupied that space. But now, no longer as a silent support. Something between them had been unearthed along with those revelations, something that could no longer be ignored. The following night, Daniel took the children to his mother's house. He said he needed to take care of some pending issues, he wanted some time to organize things, and although he didn't give many details, his mother understood with just one look. He returned home and found Clara sitting on the porch, a thin coat over her shoulders and a closed book on her lap. He approached her silently, stopped next to her and stayed there for a while, without speaking. Then he sat down. And he simply said, "You're still here." She turned her face slowly, looked into his eyes and answered firmly, but not harshly, "I am. And not out of pity. Nor because I feel I have to. But because I want to be." There was a long silence, heavy with everything that didn't need to be said out loud. And after a while, Daniel spoke again, "I don't know what I feel anymore. But I know I don't want to carry this past alone anymore." Clara got up, went inside, and came back with 2 cups of tea. She handed him one and sat on the floor, at the foot of the chair he was in. She rested her head on his leg, as if seeking shelter, but also offering it. And in that simple gesture, Daniel felt something he hadn't experienced in a long time, peace. They stayed there for hours, without speaking, as if each second served to reorganize everything that had been shattered. When dawn fell completely and the air became denser, Daniel spoke for the first time about something he had avoided even to himself: "I loved her with everything I had. And even so, she chose to lie. Not once. But always. This isn't just about infidelity. It's about destruction. I don't know if I'll ever be able to trust again." Clara lifted her head, turned, and faced him. "You will. Not because time heals, but because you are whole. And whole people rebuild themselves. Even when they don't want to." Her eyes were steady, but there was pain there too. A shared pain. Daniel brought his hand to her face, ran his fingers along her jawline, and said, "I've never seen you." "Not really. Maybe because I was blinded by someone who didn't exist as I imagined." She didn't answer. She just closed her eyes. When she opened them again, a tear fell silently. And she whispered, "I've seen you since day one. But knowing that you would never see me was my penance." That night, they slept on the living room couch, together. There were no kisses, no confessions, no promises. Just the intertwining of 2 souls that had been hurt by the same woman and that, in different ways, had always sought each other without knowing it. The days that followed were lighter. Daniel began to allow himself small spaces of joy. He took the children for walks, laughed with them, baked cakes on Sundays, and little by little his house stopped feeling like a mausoleum. Clara was still around, but now with a different kind of presence. Not just caring, but alive. She brought books, old movies, nonsensical jokes, a kind of lightness that Daniel no longer remembered existed. They began to go out together. First with the children. Then alone. A casual dinner here, a walk there. Nothing was rushed. Everything seemed to follow a new rhythm. Their own rhythm. Julia, on the other hand, had been missing for weeks. After the last visit, Daniel made it clear that any contact should be made through the lawyers. She obeyed. Until that Saturday. He was at home with Clara and the children, playing cards on the porch, when he heard the sound of the car pulling up in front. He got up before the door even slammed. Julia left hurriedly, her eyes shielded by sunglasses, but her whole body betrayed anxiety. She said she needed to see her children. Daniel replied that it was not visiting day. She insisted. She said she just wanted a hug. Clara came in with the children immediately, without a word. And Daniel stood there, staring at that woman who, for so long, had been his everything, and who was now just a memory drunk on lies. She took off her glasses and her eyes were red, but not from crying. From anger. "You threw everything away. It wasn't just my fault," she said. "You put me on a pedestal. You expected me to be perfect. You suffocated me with your kindness. And I just wanted to breathe." Daniel didn't flinch. He just crossed his arms and replied, "You breathed so much that you forgot I was by your side. It wasn't my fault for loving you right. It was yours for not knowing what to do with it." Julia came closer and tried to touch his face. Daniel pulled away. You lost. And now you want to transfer the pain to me. But I've already accepted it. You're a closed chapter. Her eyes widened, she tried to say something, but she couldn't. She turned around and got into the car. Before she drove away, she rolled down the window and said one last thing, she always wanted to be me. And now you're letting her. Daniel didn't answer. He just got in and closed the door. Not because it didn't hurt. But because it didn't matter anymore. Clara didn't need to be Julia. She never had to. And he understood that now better than ever. The following week, Daniel received a notice from his lawyer. Julia had accepted the agreement. She would give up part of her assets in exchange for avoiding public exposure. She didn't want the letters to be shown, or for her children to know the extent of her betrayal. He signed the papers with a strange feeling, a mixture of relief and mourning. Not for the woman. But for the story. For what could have been and never was. That same night, he invited Clara out to dinner. To a new restaurant, far from the neighborhood, where no one knew them. She hesitated, asked if he was sure. He replied that he wanted to be seen with her. Not as someone trying to erase the past, but as someone starting something real. The dinner was light. They laughed. They toasted. And then, they walked to the car under a clear sky. On the way back, Daniel stopped in front of the old cafe where he had met Julia. He looked around the place for a while and said, "This is where it all started. And now I know it wasn't a mistake. Because without all that, I wouldn't have met you." Clara didn't say anything. She just held his hand tightly. And in that gesture there was the certainty that something new was finally being born. But the past still had one last card to play. When they got home, they found an envelope with no return address in the mailbox. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a few handwritten words. Clara read it first. She turned pale. She handed it to Daniel. He read it. And felt the ground disappear once more. The words were short, but precise. You think you know everything. But there's something she never told you. Something that started long before you came along. Daniel looked at Clara, who looked away. And in that second, he knew the story wasn't over yet. The sheet of paper in Daniel's hand seemed to weigh tons, although it was as light as the wind that blew at the end of that night. The words written with firm strokes, familiar but unwanted handwriting, pierced his mind like blades. You think you know everything. But there's something she never told you. Something that started long before you showed up. The silence between him and Clara became dense, almost physical. She was motionless, with her hands clasped in her lap, her eyes fixed on an undefined point on the wall, as if she were trying to find an explanation there that she never tried to give. Daniel, on the other hand, stared at the paper with bated breath, feeling his heart beating in his chest like a hammer, not because of the content of the note itself, but because he knew, at that moment, that there was truth in it. It wasn't a cheap provocation, it wasn't a bluff. It was a message that hurt because it hit home something he already suspected without ever having the courage to name. He didn't ask anything right away. He stood up with the paper still in his hand, walked around the house as if he were looking for air, passed through the rooms in silence, felt the weight of the familiar walls pressing on the back of his neck and returned to the living room. Clara remained there, without saying a word. When he finally broke the silence, his voice was low, almost restrained. Did you write it? She shook her head slowly. No, the answer was quick, but it wasn't enough. Daniel approached, crouched down in front of her and looked into her eyes as if asking for more than a denial. She looked away. But you know what that means, don't you? And then she took a deep breath, as if preparing to dive into a dark sea. I know. The confession did not come as a bombshell. It came like a slow poison, which infiltrates the veins without haste, destroying from within every structure built with effort. Clara told everything in a controlled tone, as if she were repeating it to herself for the 1000th time. She talked about her difficult adolescence, about the shadow role she always played alongside her older sister, about her father's absence, about her mother who never defended her when Julia belittled her with sarcasm disguised as a joke. She said that at the age of 17, she fell in love for the first time. A naive, pure love, the kind that appears in the heart without warning. And his name was the same as the one that, years later, Julia would introduce to her family as her new boyfriend, Daniel. Clara never said anything. He accepted silence as punishment and stood on the sidelines, watching, always watching. Daniel was stunned. He stood up and took 2 steps back, as if he needed some distance to think, but his mind was spinning. What she was saying seemed unreal, and at the same time, it made sense. The long looks, the restrained care, the constant presence. It wasn't just empathy. It never was. It was love. A love that had withstood time, that had matured in silence, that had turned into loyalty, into protection, into torment. And now it was there, naked, exposed, bleeding between them. "I never planned anything," she said, amidst the whirlwind of unspoken words. "I never thought you would love me. Not for a second. I just wanted you to see who she was. That's all. And even that was too much." Daniel felt like he was losing ground for the second time. The past he knew was being rewritten mercilessly. Not by Julia. But by Clara. The only person he trusted, the one person he had truly let in after the fall. And now it all felt manipulated. But the pain he saw in her eyes wasn't fake. It was raw. It was old. It was the kind of pain that couldn't be manufactured. He walked away, saying he needed to think. That he needed to breathe away. Clara didn't insist. She just nodded, understanding what was coming. Daniel left the house aimlessly. He got in the car and drove for hours, aimlessly. He passed places from his childhood, old streets, corners where he had once dreamed of a future. Now everything seemed distant, as if he were watching his own life from the outside. He stopped in front of the sea, a place that always calmed him, and sat there, watching the waves as if waiting for time to answer for him. The image of Clara as a teenager, in love and invisible, corroded him. And at the same time, he felt a confused anger inside him, because a part of him knew, had always known, that there was something in her eyes that wasn't just compassion. When he returned home it was already dawn. Clara was still awake, but she didn't say anything. He went upstairs, went into the bedroom and lay down without saying a word. She stayed in the living room, sitting in the same place. They both knew that that night would mark them forever. The days that followed were cold. Their once light coexistence became heavy, filled with painful silences. The children, who were sensitive, noticed. They began to ask questions and tried to mediate conversations with innocent gestures. Daniel remained present, but distracted. Clara continued to take care of everything, but there was no longer any tenderness in her gestures. It was as if they were both walking on broken pieces, trying not to bleed too much, but also lacking the strength to pick up the pieces. The moral dilemma Daniel faced was more complex than he could explain. The woman who had betrayed him mercilessly had been unmasked, exposed. But the woman who had loved him silently for years, who had protected and supported him, had now hurt him too. And not out of malice, but out of truth. For not lying when perhaps I should have. For having loved before he even existed as a man by her side. Was it possible to love someone who knew you so well that they would manipulate you into revealing a betrayal? Was it possible to continue with someone whose truth was born from a lie that had been going on for years? Was it possible to start something new on the foundation of an unresolved story? Clara tried to talk. She wrote a letter and left it on the table. She said she was willing to leave if that was the best for everyone. That her love was not dependency. That she would endure, once again, the silence and the distance, if necessary. Daniel did not respond. He read the letter several times, but did not have the courage to talk about it. He felt that any word he said would open a new hole that he might not be able to close. The routine continued, mechanically. But his gaze was no longer the same. Neither was hers. There was fear in both of them. Fear of starting over, fear of losing. Fear of accepting what they felt without knowing if it was true love or just the echo of a story that needed a fairer ending. Until one day, Mateus, with his watchful eyes and restless heart, asked his father, "Are you going to send Aunt Clara away too?" Daniel knelt before his son, tried to smile, but couldn't. "Why?" he asked. And the boy, with the cruel honesty of children, answered, "Because I like it when she's here. She makes you laugh. And Leah sleeps better when she sings to her." At that moment, Daniel understood what really mattered. The following night, Clara was getting ready to leave. She had discreetly packed her suitcase. She could no longer bear the lack of response. She did not want to hurt anyone anymore. But before leaving, she stopped at the bedroom door, looked at the house one last time and took a deep breath. That was when she heard Daniel's footsteps behind her. He picked up her suitcase, placed it on the floor and held her hands. He looked into her eyes, not with anger or judgment, but with a gentle sadness, almost resigned. He simply said, "If you go now, I will spend the rest of my life wondering what would have happened if I had let you stay." She did not answer. She just cried. For the first time since everything began, she cried without restraint, without fear, without barriers. And in that hug, they both understood that the life that united them was not perfect, it was not clean, but it was real. Because sometimes love is born from old pains. And when you survive the truth, maybe you deserve a chance. Clara didn't go out that night. Daniel didn't stop her with grand speeches, he didn't hold her back with promises he didn't yet know if he could keep. What existed between them at that moment was not the passion seen in the movies, nor the romantic reconciliation that dissolves hurts like magic. What was there was humanity. Two adults, broken by choices and omissions, embraced in silence in the middle of a room that had already seen the ruin of a marriage and the beginning of a new possibility. She cried as if she had finally disarmed all her defense mechanisms. And he held her like someone who doesn't want to lose her, but doesn't yet know exactly how to keep her. When they walked away, they didn't say everything was okay. It wasn't. But there was something in his gaze that Clara had never seen before, a surrender devoid of idealizations, almost raw, of someone who finally saw in her the woman in her entirety, with her uncomfortable truths, her flaws, her crooked loyalty, but still, real. In the following days, things changed without fanfare. Clara stayed in the house, but slept in a separate room, by choice of both. Daniel needed time. Not to forgive her, because he understood that he was not directly to blame for what she felt, but to understand how to move on without repeating mistakes, without building glass castles like she did with Julia. Clara, in turn, backed off. Not out of pride, but out of respect. She dedicated herself to the children, to the house, to herself. She went back to work on a translation project she had abandoned, and began going out alone in the afternoons, walking to places that reconnected her with herself. Daniel watched from afar. And, little by little, a new version of that relationship was built, no longer based on pain, but on the recognition of two loneliness that, together, could perhaps form something stronger. The anonymous envelope, however, would not leave Daniel's mind. There were no new letters, no clues, no developments. But he knew that the note was not just cheap revenge from Julia, nor a mind game without purpose. It came from someone who knew the story too well. The tone, the choice of words, the moment. Everything indicated a message much deeper than it seemed. And even though he had decided not to confront Clara about it again, he was still worried. Not because he doubted her, but because he knew that secrets, even old ones, have the power to resurface when least expected. And this time, he wanted to be prepared. It was on a Sunday morning, while he was making pancakes with Leah in the kitchen, that his cell phone vibrated with an unidentified call. He answered it instinctively. On the other end of the line, a mature, cold female voice. Daniel, I'm Angela. I was Clara's teacher in high school. You may not know who I am, but you need to listen to me. There's something Clara has never told you. And it's about you. He didn't answer. He just listened. Angela continued calmly, as if she had already rehearsed each sentence. She said that, during her final years of high school, Clara attended a psychological support group where she volunteered. She said that it was in this group that Clara first spoke about him, an older boy, her sister's boyfriend, with whom she was secretly in love. So far, nothing he didn't already know. But then came the unexpected part. According to Angela, Clara not only knew that Julia would cheat on him, but she also indirectly participated in his getting closer to her. She was allegedly responsible for bringing them together years ago, at a time when Julia had broken up with another boyfriend, encouraging her sister to accept him, despite all the differences in style, personality, and ambition. Clara allegedly told Julia that he would be a good husband, someone who would do anything for her. And according to Angela, the reason behind this was not altruistic, it was the unconscious desire to keep Daniel close, even if it was not with her. When he hung up the phone, Daniel felt a new weight on his shoulders. It wasn't just Clara's silent love that had been with him since the beginning. It was the possibility that, from the beginning, she had shaped her presence in their lives. This was no longer about hidden love. It was about calculated choices. About manipulation. Even if motivated by affection, it was still an interference that changed everything. He stood there, motionless, with the spatula in his hands, staring at the pancakes burning in the pan, while Leah called him without understanding his sudden absence. He didn't say anything that day. Or the next. Or the next 3. He just sat in silence, trying to process what he had heard. At night, he would sit with Clara and they would talk about trivial things. She could sense his distance, but she didn't pressure him. Until one Wednesday afternoon, he didn't come home on time. He left work and drove to his old school. The school where she had gone to school. He wanted to understand. He wanted to hear it for himself. He found Angela after a few phone calls, and she greeted him with a mixture of reserve and compassion. She said she didn't want to cause him any more pain, but that she felt he needed to know the whole story so he could clearly choose his path. Angela confirmed what she had said on the phone. She said that at the time, Clara was a wounded, needy teenager, and that she saw Daniel as a safe haven, a figure of stability that she never had at home. She said that yes, Julia had been encouraged to get closer to him, even though Clara already knew about her sister's volatile nature. But she denied that it had been an evil plan. She was a girl trying to survive in an environment where she had always been invisible, Angela said. She just wanted you to stay somehow. Even if it was in her sister's shadow. Daniel thanked her. He left with his mind in a whirl. Now he understood the note. Now everything made sense. But that didn't make things any easier. He returned home that night, went in and found Clara with one of the children's books in her hands, Leah sleeping on her chest. She smiled, but his smile didn't respond. He put his daughter to bed, went downstairs and said, "We need to talk." She understood. They sat on the couch. And then he told her everything. From the phone call to the visit to the school. He didn't shout. He didn't accuse her. He just reported, word for word, what he had heard. Clara, at first, remained silent. Then, her eyes began to fill. And she simply said, "It's true. I was a girl. And I did everything wrong. But I never, at any time, imagined that one day you would turn to me. I just wanted to see you close by. That's all." Daniel listened, but he was exhausted. Emotionally, morally, spiritually. He asked her, "What now? What do we do with all this?" And she answered, "You do what's best for you. I'm not here to hold you back anymore. I just want you to be happy. Even if that means leaving me behind." The silence after that was almost deafening. Daniel didn't answer. He just left. He got in his car and drove to a hotel, where he spent the night alone. Thinking. Listening to his own doubts screaming inside his mind. The next day, he woke up before the sun. He walked along the empty shore, his feet sinking into the cold sand. He thought about his children. He thought about Julia. He thought about Clara. He thought about himself. He thought about how love can be pure and still cause harm. About how the most innocent intentions can generate irreparable consequences. And then he understood something that no one had told him before: true love is not made up of feelings alone. It demands choices, it demands maturity, it demands confrontation. And, above all, it demands forgiveness. Not the blind forgiveness that erases mistakes, but the conscious forgiveness that recognizes faults and still decides to continue. The next morning, he returned home. He found Clara with her bags packed, at the door. Her eyes said it all: she hoped that this was the end. But Daniel walked over to her, picked up her suitcase with one hand, held her face with the other and said, "Staying is also a choice. And I choose to stay." She didn't answer. She just rested her forehead against his. They breathed together. For the first time, there were no barriers. No idealizations. No secrets. Just them. Human. Wounded. And whole. Time passed, but it didn't erase anything. It shaped. It polished. It gave new forms to old pains, without ever pretending they didn't exist. The scar on Daniel's chest didn't become pride, nor shame. It became part of who he was. A living memory of everything he faced, lost, and chose to face again. The decision to stay by Clara's side wasn't followed by a soap opera romance. They didn't give in to the cliché of an overwhelming passion that redeems all mistakes. The truth was different: waking up every day next to her required him to consciously rebuild himself. And each gesture of hers, no matter how small, was a discreet attempt to deserve that space, to deserve that love that he once dreamed of in silence and that was now real, but required more courage than any youthful daydream. They didn't live in fairy tales. But they lived with dignity. The legal process with Julia came to an end without the need for exhaustive hearings. She gave in more than he expected. Maybe out of guilt, maybe out of exhaustion, or maybe because she knew she had lost irreversibly. The last time they saw each other was at the final meeting with the lawyers. Julia was too thin, with sunken eyes, the makeup disguising but not hiding the damage of a silent fall. She didn't ask for forgiveness. Or justifications. She just said that she hoped that one day he would be able to look back without bitterness. And that she hoped that her children would grow up without inheriting the shadows that she herself carried. Daniel didn't answer. Not out of contempt. But because there was nothing more to be said. She left, and this time, he didn't look back. Mateus and Leah grew up seeing their mother less frequently. The visits became spaced out, without consistency. Julia moved to another city, claiming new opportunities, and although she said she missed her children, she didn't make much of an effort to be there. Daniel didn't forbid her, didn't harbor hatred. He just let her absence reveal her own nature. On the other hand, Clara became what she had never dared to be, a haven. Not a substitute. Not a stepmother. But someone who loved without invading, who cared without needing to justify herself. The children adopted her little by little, not out of obligation, but out of recognition. And the first time Leah called Clara "Mom" was in a simple moment, while she was silently combing her hair. There was no celebration. But Clara's eyes filled with tears, and Daniel, watching from afar, knew that his decision to stay had found meaning. Life began to return to normal. Daniel's work prospered, not because of the money, but because of the peace he found in sharing his time with purpose. Clara began teaching literature in a social project, where she helped teenagers find a way to understand themselves through writing. She had experienced the impact of silence, and now, with words, she tried to free others like her. Sometimes, she would come home telling stories of young people who remembered her own journey, and Daniel would listen with silent pride. It was there that he saw in her not only the woman he loved, but the woman she had chosen to become. However, one day, something unexpected came to light. An email arrived in Daniel's inbox, with no sender identified. The content was a single video. Security cameras from a restaurant. The restaurant where he caught Julia with the other man. But the video started before he arrived. It showed Julia already seated, playing with her cell phone, visibly nervous. Until, outside, Clara appears. She comes in, says something to the waiter and leaves discreetly. Seconds later, the man arrives and sits at the table with Julia. Daniel watched the video in silence, countless times. There was no sound, but the image spoke for itself. Clara was there. On the day. At the time. Before everything happened. And she lied. That night, he couldn't sleep. The next morning, Clara found him sitting on the porch, his cell phone still in his hand. She didn't say anything, but the look in his eyes was enough. You were there. The sentence was simple, but definitive. Clara nodded. Her voice was choked. I knew where she would be. I knew in advance. I saw the conversation on her cell phone. I didn't know what to do. I wanted to tell you. But I couldn't. Daniel remained silent. She continued. I went there. I spoke to the waiter. I asked to reserve the table. Then I left. When he arrived, I was no longer there. I provoked him. I set him up. I wanted you to see. Because I couldn't stand to see you being deceived any longer. He lowered his head. You orchestrated everything. It wasn't just a warning. You pushed me to collapse. Clara approached, knelt before him. Yes. And I regret it. But it was there, at that moment, that everything began to change. I didn't know you would love me. I didn't do it for that reason. I did it because I loved you so much that I preferred to see you in ruins than to continue seeing you believing a lie. Daniel felt as if something inside him was crumbling again. The woman who had been his redemption was now the silent author of his worst day. He got up, went inside, and stayed locked in the office for hours. Leah knocked on the door. Mateus called. Clara didn't. She knew he needed that space. 3 days later, Daniel left home. He didn't fight. He didn't yell. He just left a letter. In it, he said he needed to understand who he was outside of that story. That he loved Clara, but that love, sometimes, isn't enough to hold up a ground cracked by so many versions of the truth. He said he didn't know if he would come back. But that if he did, it would be by choice. Not out of pity. And he asked her to take care of herself. To take care of her children. And of herself. For months, Clara went on alone. She continued with the children, with her classes, with her books. Sometimes she received short messages from Daniel. Questions about the children. None about her. It hurt. But she accepted it. As she accepted everything she chose, including the consequences. She knew she was not a victim. She knew that, as true as her heart was, her actions were driven by unresolved pain. She didn't blame him for leaving. Nor did she expect him to come back. But he came back. One November afternoon, Clara was teaching a small group in a makeshift classroom. Daniel came in unannounced. He waited for the activity to end and sat in the back. When everyone left, she approached slowly, her eyes brimming with tears. He looked at her with the same seriousness as when he had left that house months before. And then he said, I haven't forgotten. But I've learned to look at the bigger picture. And what you did, was wrong. But it was also what saved me. I love you. And now, more than ever, I love you knowing who you are. With everything. She cried. He held her hand. And there, without an audience, without vows, they started over. Not from scratch. But from the exact point where they chose to stay. The pain that united them was not forgotten. But it was welcomed. And transformed into something no one expected, a real love, naked, without ornaments. A love that does not deny the shadow, but grows anyway. If you've made it this far, now I want to know your opinion. What did you think of this story? Would you have done it differently? Leave a comment. And of course, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any of the next shocking stories like this one. Remember, this channel does not support, under any circumstances, any type of betrayal. This story is fiction, created to show how thoughtless choices can destroy entire lives. See you next time.